Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to this series following the River Tweed from its source down to its estuary at Berwick upon Tweed. Welcome back to all my regular viewers. I hope you're well and looking forward to this episode. Also, a warm welcome to any new viewers here for the first time. And if you are new, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss out on any forthcoming programs. This particular episode takes us from Dryburgh Abbey, which was situated just on the opposite bank to Old Melrose Abbey that we saw in the last episode, and follows the river down to Roxburgh Castle, or the site of Roxburgh Castle. From the head of the Tweed more or less to St Boswell's, which we will see shortly, the main roads have been close to the river, following routes trodden by the ancient Celtic tribes. After the Tweed passes St Boswell's, it flows through flat, open countryside, and no longer are the main roads forced to follow the same path as the river. This section of the river is quite difficult to film, and you might have noticed in the last few episodes the increasing presence of fly fishermen. And that is because this section of the river right down to Berwick is very popular with fishermen, fishing for salmon and brown trout, of course. Most of the riverbanks, therefore, are privately owned, and you can only access them if you have a permit to fish. Not being a fisherman, I don't have such a permit, and therefore it's going to be increasingly difficult for me to get onto that land to do the normal shots that I do in the river close-ups and the detail that some of you enjoy watching, and even flying the drone over these areas. So, as I say, not an easy section to film. Also in this section there are a number of mansion houses privately owned by earls and dukes, and although I've asked permission to film the river through their land, so far all have refused, and okay, I can't do anything about that. So as again, it's another restriction on what we've enjoyed so far. I mean, we didn't have any restrictions in the Upper Tweed or the middle section of the river either. But that's the situation. I will endeavour to access as much of the river as I can, and hopefully this programme will be equal to the others. I'm filming this particular episode at the end of the section, and the town you can see in the background is Kelso, and that is the subject of episode 10. The noise you might be able to hear, I don't know whether at this point whether the microphone's picking it up or not, but there's a cold, and it's a serious cold across the River Tweed, which is another popular haunt for the fishermen. Anyway, continuing on with this episode, we continue the story from episode 8, and the first feature along the river is the Dryburgh suspension bridge. The bridge was built in 1817, replacing a ferry crossing here. John and Thomas Smith of Darnick were the contractors who built it. The bridge has had to be reconstructed twice. In 1818 it was damaged by high winds, and in 1872 the walkway needed to be strengthened and replaced. From my research, it is claimed that this is the first chain bridge to be built in Britain. It is a footbridge linking pathways on both banks of the river. Crossing the bridge to the north bank, the next feature in our story greets you as you step off the bridge, and it's called the Temple of the Muses, a folly installed by the 11th Earl of Buchan in 1812. David Stuart Erskine, the 11th Earl, regarded as an eccentric, was fascinated by Scottish history and founded the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland in 1780. He purchased the Dryburgh estate towards the end of the 1700s, acquiring the ruins of Dryburgh Abbey as the quintessential garden ornament. Not content with that, he added the Temple of the Muses, which stands at the summit of a small mound. It was unveiled in 1812 and built by the Earl's favoured stonemason, John Smith of Darnick. It is dedicated to the poet James Thomson, who lived in nearby Ednam and was a great favourite of the Earl. The poet's most famous work was The Seasons, and he also wrote the lyrics of Rule Britannia. There's something to keep in your diary for your next pub quiz. On the top of the domed roof of the temple is a carved bust of the poet. Just a few hundred metres north of the temple is another structure installed by the Earl, and that is the William Wallace statue. It too was built by John Smith of Darnick 2 years after he finished the temple in 1814. There are more statues and memorials to Wallace all over Scotland, including Edinburgh, Aberdeen and Stirling. The monument in Stirling, entitled Freedom, was made in 1996 and carved to resemble Mel Gibson, who played the part of Wallace in the film Braveheart. The statue here at Dryburgh is a more realistic likeness of William Wallace, as far as the records show, that is. A local historian I met when I was filming the Ettrick in Selkirk said that the statue was due for demolition in the 1990s, but after the film Braveheart, because of visitor numbers increasing, that decision was reversed and it's still here today. A few hundred metres further north lies Bemerside House and Gardens, which is owned by the Hague family, as it has been since the 12th century. It was built by the de Hagas family, who came across from Normandy with William the Conqueror. Thomas the Rhymer wrote, "Tide, tide, whate'er the tide, thou'll always be Hagues at Bemerside." In 1535, the Scottish Parliament ordered all landowners with lands over a certain acreage to build a peel tower to defend their property, and I mentioned this in episode 7. The tower has fashioned stone from Dryburgh Abbey incorporated into the walls. Additional extensions to the building were added during later periods. Apartments can be rented for holiday stays. I suggest you research Bemerside House and Gardens if you wish to do that or wish to know more. The hill crest at Scott's View above Bemerside is said to be the finest in Scotland, and it was certainly a favourite spot for Sir Walter Scott. Apparently his funeral cortege stopped here for several minutes on the way to Dryburgh Abbey, where Sir Walter Scott is buried. Similar to the loop in the Tweed we saw at Old Melrose in episode 8, another loop in the river bending in the opposite direction provides the location for another abbey, and this time it's Dryburgh Abbey. This abbey was primarily established in 1150 by Hugh de Morville. He was the landowner here, and he established the abbey in conjunction with a pre-Monstratensian Catholic order based in Alnwick in Northumbria. Hugh de Morville came from Normandy with William the Conqueror. The pre-Monstratensian white-robed Catholic order originated in Lyon in northern France. There is an idea in historical realms that anyone of any wealth, be it a king, a duke, an earl, or whatever, would endow abbeys on their land with the sole intention that the presence of the monks would be able to say prayers, ensuring their longevity and safety, bearing in mind, of course, that these times were steeped in violence and war. Hugh de Morville had that sole intention when he proposed the abbey's construction. He couldn't compete with the wealth of King David I at Melrose Abbey, but he did a pretty good job at Dryburgh nonetheless. As I mentioned in the Ettrick episode and also in episode 8, Edward II's failed invasion of Scotland in 1322 resulted in his army burning the monasteries in Melrose and here at Dryburgh. The monks here had been a bit hasty in ringing the bells of the abbey in celebration of the defeat of the English, which prompted Edward's men to destroy the abbey in rage. The abbey was restored only to be severely damaged in 1385 when it was burned again, this time by Richard II's army. The restoration, which lasted well into the 1400s, saw the abbey rebuilt bigger and better than before. Dryburgh thrived until Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, which began in 1539. His marshals arrived with an army of 700 men on the 4th of November 1544, destroying the abbey and the settlement of Dryburgh that existed immediately around the abbey. Any thoughts of rebuilding the abbey a third time were dashed with the onset of the Scottish Reformation in 1560 and the Covenanters. Only 8 monks had survived, and they were allowed to continue living out their lives at Dryburgh, and the last of them dying in 1600. As I mentioned earlier, the ruins were bought by David Stewart Erskine, the 11th Earl of Buchan, in 1786. He did a lot of work to preserve the ruins and installed the formal gardens around the ruins and the obelisk commemorating Hugh de Morville. The town of St Boswell's lies on the south bank of the Tweed opposite Dryburgh Abbey. The town gets its name from St Boisil, a monk from the monastery at Old Melrose. However, originally it was known as Lessedon, and there are two theories on what that name means. The website Undiscovered Scotland states it means the meadow by the sloping pasture. The other explanation is that the name was a derivative of Les Edwin, meaning the manor of Edwin, referring to King Edwin of Northumbria. He had a fortress here and granted the lands around it to Melrose Abbey. Passing through St Boswell's on the main A68 road from Jedburgh, you can't help noticing the village green flanked by some substantial houses. The green is said to be the largest village green in Scotland and was even larger in the past centuries. It was the site of an annual gypsy fair held for the purpose of trading horses. Travelling families would come from all over Scotland to attend it. The original village was one long high street named Main Street. Several new housing developments have greatly increased its population to date. In the mid-19th century, plans were drawn up to site a railway station on the village green as an extension of the Waverley line. Members of the Buccleuch Hunt objected to this, and a decision was made to site it a mile to the northwest in Newtown. The town of Newtown St Boswell's rapidly grew in size around this new station as a result. Newtown St Boswell's is actually a very long established community dating back to medieval times. Over the years it has adopted a variety of names, including Newtown, Newton, Newtown of Eildon and Newtown of Dryburgh. The town became Newtown St Boswell's in 1849 when the Edinburgh and Howick Railway Company decided to call the station it opened in Newtown St Boswell's. As happened elsewhere, an arbitrary naming decision made by a railway executive came into common use. Now, you might be forgiven for asking at this point, but what about the Tweed? After all, this whole series is supposedly about the river. Well, of course, you would be right. And so far, all of the points that I've mentioned are all situated within 1 square mile of the river banks. So we haven't travelled anywhere along the river yet. However, after St Boswell's, there is no features on the river at all, apart from one, which we will visit, until you get to the end of this particular section, which is where I'm standing now, at Kelso. So let's now concentrate on the river itself. And the last 10 miles that we've filmed in earlier episodes has seen the Tweed twisting and turning, sometimes almost doubling back on itself. And in geographical terms, this is called or referred to as Oxbow Bends. The banks of the river are all privately owned, as I mentioned earlier, and licensed access is given to fly fishermen for catching salmon and brown trout. You may have also noticed in the past few episodes that along the river banks is increasingly rocks being placed and island refuges jutting out from the banks of the river. Now, this is primarily to prevent erosion of the banks, because the fishermen are stepping on and off the banks into the shallow water at the edge, and obviously them stepping on and off would erode the banks. So it's partly for that, but also these piers that have been appearing are simply to bubble up the water where it's sort of fairly still and slow flowing, and it's to oxygenate the water so that the fish can remain healthy into the upper reaches of the river. From Old Melrose, the Tweed is flanked by heavily wooded banks until it gets to St Boswell's. The golf course on the south bank of the river provides a more open space for the river to flow through. Just past St Boswell's, the river enters the last double bend in this sequence of meanders. It first encounters a weir, or a cold as it's known here in the borders, and then immediately after that it flows under Mertoun Bridge. The bridge was constructed with 5 arches by James Slight in 1839. The piers and abutments were built of red sandstone with wooden arches in between. The wooden arches were replaced with stone at a later date, as you see it today. The final bend in the river takes us past the Mertoun estate, which is the home of the Earl of Ellesmere and now the Duke of Sutherland. I did ask permission to film the house and the gardens, but sadly I was refused. I guess His Grace was not interested appearing on my channel. Then again, I don't have the clout of the BBC or Hollywood for that matter. But never mind, we can't have everything. The Tweed now flows in more of a straight course, and within a mile on its south bank passes Little Dean Tower. This was the family seat of the Kerr family, another infamous Reaver family, also known as the Kerrs of Cessford. Mark Kerr, a descendant of the clan, had married Marjorie Ainsley of Dolphinston Castle near Jedburgh in the early 1500s, and thereby increased his land and wealth. The Kerrs were the Barons of Maxton, slightly south and west of here. The Kerrs, now being substantial landowners here, were instructed in 1535 to build a peel tower in defence of their lands, just as all the other similar landowners were told. The original tower was 4 stories tall and a typical oblong shape. Edward II's retreating army attacked the tower in 1544, as they did with everything else in the area. The tower escaped relatively unscathed though. The Kerrs had warning of what was happening in the surrounding towns and had time to smear the walls and roof with mud and clay, which prevented it catching alight from the torches brandished by Edward's army. In the years following the attack, a D-shaped tower was added to the side of the building with defensible gun loops. Further reinforcements were made and measures taken against any further attacks. The Kerrs abandoned the tower when they experienced more good fortune in the 1700s and left for Nenthorne House nearby. The Tweed continues eastward towards Kelso for another 6 miles, flowing through open countryside. Before the river reaches Kelso, the Tweed meets with one of its main tributaries, Teviot Water, and we will follow that river in the next episode. Sandwiched between the two rivers, 500 metres from their confluence, stands Roxburgh Castle ruins. This served as one of Scotland's main fortifications over many centuries, and also the scene of many battles. King David I granted royal status to Roxburgh in 1120, and 5 years later instructed a castle to be built to protect the borough. David's rise to importance had happened after his father and elder brother were killed in the Battle of Alnwick in 1093. David was the 8th and youngest son. The power struggle that followed eventually resulted in David becoming the brother-in-law to King Henry I of England. David found favour in the English court, which helped his rise to power in Scotland. He was given the area covering the eastern border region as part of his rightful inheritance, and the title Prince of the Cumbrians. Alexander, one of his older brothers, was king at that time and was not happy with this decision. But he was overruled by the more powerful King Henry of England. David needed to strengthen his position and show his importance. He did this by declaring most of the region under his control as being royal boroughs. Selkirk, Peebles, Berwick, Lanark and Roxburgh all benefited from David's declaration. After his brother's death in 1124, David became King of Scotland. The castle at Roxburgh was originally called Marchmount. It was protected on one side by the Tweed and the other side by Teviot Water, which was partially dammed to create a moat around the castle. In 1174, the King of Scotland was William I, known to the Scots as William the Lion. He saw an opportunity to regain the lands of Northumbria and Cumbria, which the Scots had controlled centuries before. King Henry II of England was fighting in France at the time. William's plan backfired, and he and his army suffered a humiliating defeat at the Second Battle of Alnwick that same year. The Scots were forced to surrender all the main castles in Scotland, including Stirling, Edinburgh, Berwick and Roxburgh. In 1189, King Richard I needed to raise money to fight the Crusades and sold Roxburgh Castle back to the Scots. In 1291, after the accidental death of Alexander III, which I recounted in episode 5, King Edward I was invited to Scotland to arbitrate between the rival claims to the throne of Scotland. In 1292, he chose John Balliol, and he was given Roxburgh Castle. By 1296, John Balliol had fallen out of favour with Edward, igniting the border wars. The Battle of Dunbar that same year saw the Scots defeated, and Roxburgh was surrendered to the English. William Wallace was executed in 1305, and Robert the Bruce took over his mantle, fighting for independence. In an attempt to quell Robert's uprising, Edward ordered his sister Mary Bruce to be imprisoned in a cage hung from the castle walls at Roxburgh. In 1307, Edward I died and Robert the Bruce recaptured Roxburgh, although months later it was back under English control. Now, when I was doing the research for this particular aspect, there were two conflicting stories. So one version of events is what I've just said in the last sentence, that Robert the Bruce recaptured Roxburgh and freed his sister. However, there's another set of documents in the Scottish archives which suggest that Robert the Bruce did not recapture Roxburgh, that Mary hung in that cage for 4 years. In about 1310, she was transferred to Newcastle and imprisoned there in the keep under better conditions. So, as I say, two conflicting pieces of evidence there. I've pointed out both sides of the story, and that's as much clarity as I've got on it at this point. In 1314, James Douglas, one of Bruce's best generals, recaptured the castle during the night darkness with just 60 men. They were disguised in black cloaks to look like cattle. They managed to sneak up to the castle and took the English garrison by surprise. Later that same year, the English were defeated at the Battle of Bannockburn, and the castle was once again back in Scottish hands. Throughout the 1300s and the first half of the 1400s, the toing and froing continued between the English and Scottish, having control of the castle. In 1460, James II laid siege to the castle, during which he was killed when one of his own cannons blew up. James's widow, Mary of Guelders, continued the siege, and eventually the castle was taken. She then had the castle demolished, and it has been a ruin ever since. In 1545, during the campaign of the rough wooing in the borders, the castle site was occupied by the English, who built a rectangular fort. After the Treaty of Boulogne was signed in 1550, this fort was destroyed, and the site has been unoccupied since. The land is owned by the Duke of Roxburgh at Floors Castle, situated on the north bank of the Tweed. in one final sweeping bend around Friars Hoff, the Tweed tumbles over a cald and then meets with Teviot water, which, as I said earlier, is the subject of the next episode. But that concludes this particular episode. And as I always say, if you've enjoyed it, then please give me the thumbs up and the like. Subscribe if you haven't already done that, especially you new viewers here for the first time. Give the video description link to a friend or a family member so they can watch it. Maybe suggest to that friend or family member or someone you know to subscribe to the channel. It all helps it to grow, and therefore I can reach more people and show more people the work that I do. Those of you who wish to support the channel financially, go to that blue PayPal link at the top of my homepage and leave a small donation. As I keep saying, every single episode I have to pay travelling from Newcastle to the border region, which is quite substantial. I also have to pay entry fees into these places, Dryburgh Abbey for example, Floors Castle. They don't let me in for free. Even if they get free advertising out of it, that has no credence with them. I still have to pay for entry. I'm not crying hard up, but I'm an old age pensioner, and therefore all of that cost has to come out of what I can afford. If you wish me to keep going with these programs, then I do need help from time to time. And as I said, even if over 3,000 subscribers I've got now, if everybody just donated £1, I would have enough money for all year to do an entire series. That's, you know, how it is. The best way you can help is watching the program right through to the end, till the last title's gone up, till the last bar of the music fades, because what that does is it not only gets recorded as a full view on YouTube, but it increases the watch hours, because it's a bit like a football league table. The more likes I get, the more comments you send, the more watch time hours I get. People that watch it, the full program right through to the end, are like points in a football game. So it gets me up the ladder. What that means is that when YouTube are suggesting films to different people all over the world, they're more likely to get a suggestion of my channel than somebody else's. That's how it helps. That's how the YouTube algorithm works. So any of those things that I've mentioned all help me. Having said all of that, I'm going to wish you goodbye from the banks of the Tweed. I hope you're all well. I wish you good health, and I'll see you, well, literally just a few hundred meters further down the Tweed in the next episode. But till then, goodbye for now.